The earliest recorded Viking attacks occurred in the 790s and continued until the Norman conquest of England in 1066. A period commonly referred to as the Viking Age in Scandinavian history. However, the Normans were descendants of Danish Vikings who had been granted land in northern France, forming the Duchy of Normandy, in the 10th century. As a result, Viking descendants continued to have an influence in northern Europe. Similarly, King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, who ended the life of one of the last pagan Viking kings, was himself killed just a few weeks later in the Norman invasion of 1066, by the descendants of Danish Vikings. Geographically, the Viking Age refers not only to the Scandinavian lands, modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, but also to the territories dominated by the North Germanic peoples. Primarily Danelaw, which included the city of York, the administrative centre of what remained of the Kingdom of Northumbria, as well as parts of Mercia and East Anglia. The Vikings pioneered sea routes to new lands in the west, north, and east, resulting in independent settlements in Shetland, Orkney, and the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and Landseo Meadows. A short-lived settlement in Newfoundland around 1000 AD. Many of these lands, such as Greenland and Iceland, may have initially been discovered by sailors blown off course by strong winds. They may also have been found based on reports from sailors who had glimpsed distant lands. The Greenland settlement was eventually abandoned, possibly due to climate change. Vikings also explored and settled among the Slavic peoples, dominating parts of Eastern Europe, particularly the Kievan Rus, which by 950 AD had become largely Slavicized. As early as 839, when Swedish envoys first visited Greece, Scandinavians had already begun serving as mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire. By the late 10th century, a new imperial guard unit was established, traditionally recruiting a significant number of Scandinavians. This force became known as the Varangian Guard. The term, Varangian, may have originated from Old Norse, but in Slavic and Greek, it referred to Scandinavians or Franks. The most famous Scandinavian to serve in the Varangian Guard was Harald Hardrada, who later proclaimed himself King of Norway, 1047 to 1066. Major trading ports during this period included Birka, Hedeby, Kaupang, Jorvik, Staria Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kiev. Generally, the Norwegians expanded north and west to places like Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, and Greenland, while the Danes moved toward England and France, settling in Danelaw, the northeastern part of England, and Normandy. Meanwhile, the Swedes ventured eastward. Despite their regional differences, these Viking groups shared a common culture and language. The names of Scandinavian kings only became widely known in the later part of the Viking Age. It was only after the Viking Age ended that these regions developed distinct national identities, largely due to the process of Christianization. Thus, the end of the Viking Age in Scandinavia also marked the beginning of their relatively short medieval period. Tributes and ransoms. In the year 880, some members of the Great Heathen Army invaded Wessex once again. Later, they left England and attacked northern France and Belgium. Others invaded Germany before returning to England. The Vikings often demanded a tribute called Danegeld. One Viking leader, Ragnar, invaded Paris with 150 ships. The King of France had to pay the Vikings an amount of silver equal to $50 million today to make them leave. However, this did not stop Viking raids for long. The invaders divided the money and took it home. In the 9th century, the French had to pay £685 in gold and £43.042 in silver to the Vikings. In 911, King Charles of France had to give up part of his kingdom to a Danish Viking leader named Rollo the Walker in exchange for his promise to drive away other Vikings. This land became known as Normandy, meaning land of the Northmen. When the Vikings attacked higher-ranking nobles, the Danegeld, ransom, became even larger. In 1012, the Vikings demanded £48 in silver as ransom for the Archbishop of Canterbury, whom they had captured. When they did not receive more money, they beat the Archbishop to death using bones. 4 years later, King Cnut the Great of Denmark conquered all of England. After his victory, he collected £82.500 in silver and declared himself king. The Great Heathen Host. After the year 800 AD, Viking attacks increased without stopping. A French monk wrote about the Vikings, saying they brought fire and sword everywhere, tortured and imprisoned people, destroyed all monasteries, and left behind only fear. As time passed, these attacks turned into full-scale invasions. Viking pirates settled in Orkney and Shetland, in the north of Ireland, where they took local people as slaves. Others built fortresses in Ireland and attacked monasteries. In 844, the Vikings settled on islands off the coast of France, and by 851, they had spent their first winter in England. In 865, A group of Danes formed a band known as the Great Heathen Host. For 30 years, they invaded Western Europe, carrying a banner with a flying raven. They conquered northern and eastern England and established a territory known as Danelaw, the Law of the Danes. As this Danish army moved further south into the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, King Alfred was forced to retreat into a swamp with a small group of guerrilla fighters. He then launched a series of successful counterattacks against the Danish invaders. By May 878, King Alfred forced the Vikings to surrender and secured a temporary peace. The Danes retreated and settled further east, and around 30 Danish leaders were baptized and converted to Christianity. When facing King Alfred and his army, the Vikings formed a shield wall, like a naval battle, and raised their raven banner, which they believed would bring them victory. However, the battle quickly turned into a disaster. 840 Danes were killed, and the famous banner was captured. The Vikings were expert sailors, traveling across the North Atlantic, as far south as North Africa, and as far east as Russia, Constantinople, and the Middle East. They were raiders, traders, settlers, and mercenaries. Under the leadership of Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, the Vikings even reached North America and established a short-lived settlement in what is now Landseo Meadows, Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The reasons behind Viking expansion remain a subject of debate in Nordic history. One popular theory suggests that Charlemagne used force and terror to spread Christianity among all pagans, demanding conversion through baptism, religious change, or death by iron and blood. This may have led to Viking revenge. Professor Rudolf Simek confirmed that it is no coincidence that the first Viking activity occurred during the reign of Emperor Charlemagne. The spread of Christianity into Scandinavia created serious conflicts, dividing Norway for almost a century. Another common explanation is that the population in Scandinavia grew faster than food production. For coastal communities with advanced seafaring skills, expanding overseas became an effective solution. However, this explanation does not fully explain why the Vikings chose foreign expansion instead of clearing the vast forests of the Scandinavian peninsula. It is important to note that raiding was easier than farming in a cold climate with a short growing season. The idea that population growth or declining agricultural production fueled Viking expansion has not been definitively proven. Another theory suggests that the Vikings took advantage of a period of weakness in neighboring countries. For example, Danish Vikings saw the internal division of Charlemagne's empire starting in the 830s, as well as religious conflicts within England, which made the region vulnerable. Many towns located near the sea or rivers became easy targets. The lack of organized naval defense across Western Europe allowed Viking ships to move freely, raiding and trading wherever opportunities arose. The decline of traditional trade routes may have also played a role. Trade between Western Europe and the rest of Eurasia suffered a major blow after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. The expansion of Islam in the 7th century further disrupted trade in Western Europe. By the time Viking expansion began, Mediterranean trade had fallen to its lowest point. By opening new trade routes into Arab lands and Frankish territories, the Vikings benefited from international trade by expanding beyond their traditional boundaries. Viking combat tactics. At first, Viking raids were carried out by only a few men with a small number of ships. However, as news of their success spread and with the rise of a unified and powerful kingdom in Norway and Denmark, larger Viking armies landed and stayed onshore for longer periods. Eventually, they began wintering in the territories they seized and later settling in the best lands they had conquered. They often captured local horses to increase their mobility and operational range. This was the method the Vikings used when they advanced from East Anglia, which they had taken from the Anglo-Saxons, to attack York in 866. From the year 850, Danish Vikings began wintering in England, demanding ransom, Danegeld, in exchange for promises of peace. The region of Kent paid a large sum in 865. But it still fell victim to a major attack soon after. After the year 870, the Vikings controlled a vast area in central England, from coast to coast, and established the Danelaw. For many generations, Anglo-Saxon leaders tried to reclaim the so-called Danelaw. These efforts often led to battles such as the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 and the Battle of Maldon in 991, where the Vikings proved they could fight on equal terms with their opponents in land battles. Of particular interest is the Battle of Brunanburh, where Vikings fought on both sides. On one front, they fought against the Anglo-Saxon army, supported by Danish mercenaries. On another front, the battle involved rebellious Norwegian lords in Ireland fighting against Danish Vikings in eastern Danelaw. In the early days, the Vikings used horses only for transportation, like the old Viking in paintings, riding a horse to rest his legs. But later, they also attempted to form Viking cavalry units. Battles in northern and western Europe were mainly infantry battles during the early Middle Ages. Cavalry battles were rare before the 11th century. Although the Franks had a high-quality cavalry force, cavalry was a crucial part of the Byzantine Empire's military in southern and eastern Europe during this time. The Vikings themselves saw horses mainly as a means of transport and communication. The Vikings were defeated by the Franks at the Battle of Saucourt in 881 and by the Byzantines at the Battle of Silistra in 972. Due to the absolute superiority of cavalry, however, there is no rule without exceptions. Written records show that in 888, the Vikings deployed their own cavalry at the Battle of Montfaucon in France and at the Battle of Solcoit in Ireland in 968. Sometimes, the timing and location of a battle were critical factors. Additionally, Viking raiding habits, plundering enemy lands just before a battle, could influence outcomes. The Anglo-Saxons were able to use this valuable time to gather their forces, as seen in the Battle of Brunanburh. The shield wall. The primary Viking formation in battle was the shield wall, also known as Skjoldborg. Warriors stood side by side, holding their shields so that the edges touched or even overlapped. However, overlapping shields prevented enough space for swinging swords or axes, so the front line's role was mainly to push against the enemy and block incoming spears. Behind the shield wall, warriors with long spears attacked over the shoulders of those in front. Terrain could be a decisive factor in victory or defeat. For example, holding the high ground was a significant advantage. Depending on the size of the army, multiple shield walls could be formed, one positioned behind another. From the beginning, the Vikings often sought to gain a decisive advantage over their enemies with surprise attacks. Their raiding parties typically landed on beaches or sailed up river mouths under the cover of darkness or bad weather. The Roman concept of a standing army had seemingly disappeared from northern Europe since the 5th century, as these regions had to deal with hit-and-run raids from the Frisians, Anglo-Saxons, and Franks. This lack of permanent forces meant defenders had little time to identify threats and mobilize large defensive forces. Viking raid targets were carefully selected to ensure success, with monasteries being among the most common targets. These held great wealth but were poorly defended. There is evidence that javelin throwers and archers were deployed both in front and behind the main army to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's shield wall. After the initial missile exchange, the front lines would clash, with warriors pushing, stabbing with spears, and hacking with battle axes until one side managed to break through the other's shield wall. During battle, gaps in the shield wall would sometimes open slightly, allowing warriors to swing their war axes and swords more effectively. Weak points in a shield wall could be attacked by a specialized formation called the Svinvilking, a wedge-shaped formation. It consisted of 2 warriors at the front, followed by 3 in the second row, 5 in the third, and so on. The outer warriors overlapped their shields, while spear-wielding fighters inside drove forward, piercing through the enemy's defenses. If the integrity of a shield wall was broken, it was not uncommon for the formation to collapse into chaos. This was the moment when leadership became crucial. A strong leader needed to rally and reorganize his warriors, or deploy reinforcements held in reserve. Viking armies in the early Middle Ages were typically composed of 3 main types of warriors. Freemen, who were required to serve when summoned. Herzier, wealthy warriors loyal to a jarl, chieftain, or later, a king, along with other armed men from their lands. Retainers, personal followers who had sworn loyalty to a leader. The main objective of a battle was usually the opposing leader. If the enemy leader was killed, his warriors, who were rarely well trained in combat, would be freed from their obligation to fight and would either surrender or flee. However, sworn retainers were bound by honor and would continue to fight around their fallen lord until they were killed. Naval warfare. Viking naval battles followed the same principles as land battles. The ships of each side were tied together with ropes, forming a continuous battle platform with a shield wall along the decks. Attackers would attempt to break this formation, as seen in battles like Haversfjord, 872, Svolder, 1000, and Nyssa, 1062. Ships would be attacked one by one, separated from the main formation, and then left adrift. Both sides kept a few ships unbound for maneuvering, scouting, and skirmishing. Vikings often boarded enemy ships by swimming alongside them and climbing onto the deck under a storm of arrows, stones, and javelins. If the defenders managed to kill the enemy rowers or break their oars, the attacking force would lose maneuverability, making victory much harder. However, some elements of classical naval warfare, such as advanced tactics, ramming, forcing the enemy to sail against the wind, or using catapults, were well known to the Vikings. Most Viking naval battles took place in calm coastal waters or river mouths, where there was little space for these complex maneuvers. The Viking army. The size of the Viking army varied greatly. increasing steadily from the late 8th century to the 11th century. An early Anglo-Saxon manuscript from the pre-Viking age refers to a group of around 35 warriors or more as an army. So it can be assumed that the earliest Viking raids were carried out by small bands of this size. Even in later historical records describing battles, the exact number of Viking warriors is rarely mentioned. The size of a Viking army was often estimated based on the number of ships and their crew size, which depended on the number of oars. For example, records of the Siege of Paris in 886 claim that the Vikings had 40,000 warriors and 700 ships. This estimation is based on an average of fewer than 60 oars per ship, but the actual number of crew members could vary. However, historical figures from ancient sources are often considered more impressive than mathematically precise. The early Viking raids were usually led by a local chieftain aiming to gain land at home, acquire valuable loot, or capture slaves for sale abroad. His crew was often recruited from men within the same family or clan, along with a few neighbors. Each man was responsible for equipping himself, hoping that his share of the plunder would compensate for the investment. Most Vikings were both warriors and traders. At one moment, they raided and looted, and at another, they sold their stolen goods elsewhere. Their leader was usually elected, but major decisions were often discussed and agreed upon by the entire group. Some Viking warriors were very young, only 15 or even 12 years old, when they joined a raid for the first time. From childhood, boys learned strength, agility, and awareness through hunting, and their fathers trained them in combat skills, which they practiced with friends. The unification of Norway and Denmark into kingdoms changed the structure of the Viking military. To defend the country, Scandinavian kingdoms introduced a system called ledding, which was a military conscription system. Under this system, every free landowner was required to provide soldiers, military equipment, ships, and weapons, with the exact amount depending on the size of his land. Later, the ledding system was replaced by a military tax, which was used to pay for professional soldiers. The king commanded his army and was protected by the herd, his personal bodyguards, each of whom had sworn loyalty to him. There is some doubt about the accuracy of historical numbers, but large Viking armies were not uncommon. The Norsemen, Norwegian Vikings, are believed to have lost at least 8,000 warriors in the Battle of Sorcourt in 881. The army of King Harald Hardrada, which was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, is estimated to have lost between 240 and 300 ships. In 991, Olaf Tryggvason led a fleet of 93 ships in a raid on Malden, intending to raise funds for his campaign to reclaim the throne of Norway. Occasionally, some kings, such as Harald Bluetooth, provided weapons and even armor for part of their army. Hiring mercenaries was another common practice. For example, the army of Thorkel the Tall fought only for themselves and whoever paid in the highest price. Fortifications. Several fortifications from the Viking Age are known, such as the wall castles at Furkat, Aggersborg, Trelleborg, and Narnebakken, as well as Danework. These great defensive structures were located in southern Jutland. They were 2 meters, 6.5 feet, high and 12 meters, 39 feet, wide, made of wood, and connected natural obstacles to provide protection against Slavic and Germanic raiding parties. The first part of this system was built in 737, and the final section was completed in 968. The total length of the fortifications was around 30 kilometers, 18.6 miles, with only one gateway leading to Viborg. Hedeby, Heithabu, one of the most important trade cities of the time, was located near Danework. However, even Danework was not enough to stop the German forces under Emperor Otto II, who conquered much of southern Denmark in 974, though they were driven out in 983. All 4 major Viking fortresses were built in the second half of the 10th century and were structurally similar, differing only in size. Each fortress had a circular wall, a deep moat, and 2 main roads intersecting at the center. At Trelleborg, Furkat, and Narnebakken, there were 16 large longhouses, divided into 4 symmetrical groups. At Aggersborg, the buildings were twice the diameter of those in the other fortresses and contained 3 times as many buildings. Outside the main walls, there were additional fences and buildings, though their arrangement varied by location. While these fortifications were clearly military in nature, their primary purpose appears to have been to protect the local population and to provide suitable accommodations for the representatives of the Danish king. An overview of Viking weapons and armor. In the early days of Viking raids, only a small number of Vikings were fully equipped with armor, helmets, and swords. These were usually the wealthiest warriors. Such weapons and armor were often passed down through generations. A father would raid, and his son would follow in his footsteps. Most ordinary Viking warriors were armed only with weapons available at home or easily crafted weapons. These included round shields, wooden clubs, knives, used for cutting meat and fish at home, long spears, which required only a long wooden shaft with a small iron tip, battle axes, which could also be used for chopping wood in peacetime, javelins, also used for hunting, bows and arrows. Swords were especially rare and expensive, as they required high-quality iron and advanced blacksmithing skills to forge. Viking ships. There is little evidence to convince the rest of Europe that the Vikings were highly skilled carpenters, great shipbuilders, and expert sailors. Although their ships were made of wood, many Viking ships have survived in remarkable condition because they were buried in ship graves, and the soil preserved them well. Some of the most famous Viking ships were found in burial sites in Gokstad and Oseberg, Norway. In reality, Viking ships were the best crafted vessels of their time. They were built using the clinker method, which made the hull flexible enough to withstand high waves and fierce storms at sea. Clinker-built ships had overlapping wooden planks fastened onto a strong framework with cross beams, and the joints were reinforced to make them watertight. There were different types of Viking ships, each designed for specific purposes, and they were known as Draka, Karv, Snekker, Skida, or Nar, depending on size and function. One of the most famous Viking ship types was the longship. It had elegant lines, allowing it to reach high speeds in the water. A longship was fairly long, about 20 meters or 65 feet, and narrow, about 5 meters or 16 feet, making it suitable for shallow waters. The longship had only one central mast with a large, square, colorful sail, often designed with checkered patterns in blue, red, or gray stripes. It also had rows of oars on both sides, so the ship was not dependent on the wind during calm weather. The ship was steered by a large oar at the stern, which functioned as a rudder. The bow and stern of a longship were often beautifully carved in the shapes of wild animals, most commonly a dragon's head made of metal. Some wealthy Vikings even decorated their ships with gold or silver, which would shine in the sunlight, perhaps to impress enemies and scare away evil spirits. When Viking ships arrived or departed from a port, they would have round shields with various colors hung along the sides of the ship. However, these shields were removed once the ship reached open waters. Because Viking ships had a shallow draft, they could sail close to the coast, land directly on shore, or even navigate up rivers. By the late 8th century, these ships had been perfected to the point that they could sail across the open sea. Viking merchant ships were quite different from longships. They had a wider and deeper hull, designed for carrying cargo rather than speed and warfare. The Siege of Paris. Returning to the significance of the Vikings in the fall of the Carolingian dynasty. We know that by the second half of the 9th century, after the death of Emperor Charlemagne, the Frankish kingdom fell into internal conflicts and was eventually divided into East Francia and West Francia. The successors of Charlemagne were mediocre rulers, more focused on internal struggles than on protecting their people. As a result, the Vikings frequently launched increasingly large and deeper raids into Frankish territories. And the Siege of Paris was one such attack. The Siege of Paris, 885 to 886, was a Viking attack on the city of Paris, which later became the capital of the West Frankish kingdom. It was one of the most significant events during the reign of Emperor Charles the Fat and a turning point for the Carolingian dynasty and the history of France. The Vikings, especially the Danes from the British Isles and Norsemen from mainland Europe, were the main threat to European rulers during the late 9th century. In what was the middle of the Viking Age, they had already established a territory called Danelaw in England and ruled over the Rus people. From Lake Ladoga to Novgorod, their influence spread as far as the Mediterranean, where they harassed both Christian and Muslim communities, raiding coastal plains and river estuaries in France, Spain, and Italy. The worst hit areas in the Carolingian Empire were the Low Countries and the regions around Gaul and Germania, which had many rivers, making them easily accessible by Viking longships. In 845, the Vikings sailed up the Seine River and attacked Paris. They struck again 3 more times in the 860s, only leaving after looting the city and receiving ransom payments they found acceptable. In 864, under the Edict of Pistis, several bridges were built along the Seine River, not only in Pistis but also in Paris, where 2 bridges were under construction, one on each side of Isle de la Cite. These bridges would play a critical role in the siege of 885. The highest-ranking ruler in the Paris region, Isle de France, was the Duke of Francia, who was also the Duke of Paris, controlling the land between the Seine and Loire rivers. The first notable leader was Robert the Strong, the Margrave of Neustria and Mrs. Dominicus of the Loire Valley. He strengthened the city's fortifications and fought the Norsemen until he was killed in battle against the Vikings at Brissath. His son, Odo, inherited his position and continued to fortify Paris. A 9th century map of Paris shows that it was just a small town located in the middle of the Seine River, with 2 bridges connecting it to the riverbanks. These bridges played a crucial role, preventing the Vikings from advancing deeper into France. Meanwhile, West Francia, the core of modern France, saw a series of short-lived rulers until Charles the Fat, King of Germany and Italy, also became King of West Francia. Hopes of reuniting the Frankish Empire under a single ruler, as in Charlemagne's time, were revived. However, only 1 year after Charles inherited the throne, in 884, the Vikings launched their largest attack on Paris once again. The siege. Sigfrid, the leader of the Danish Vikings, demanded a ransom from Charles, but his request was denied. He quickly sent 700 ships up the Seine River, carrying over 30,000 warriors, a number that should be questioned, as even 1/10 of that force would have been a significant army at the time. At this time, Paris was merely a small town located on an island. Its strategic importance came from its ability to block the passage of Viking ships with 2 low bridges, one made of wood and the other made of stone. Even the shadows of Viking ships could not pass Paris because of these bridges. Odo prepared for the Vikings' arrival by fortifying both bridgeheads with 2 watchtowers on each bridge. However, he had very few soldiers, no more than 200 armed men. He was assisted by his brother Robert, along with 2 dukes, a margrave, and Jocelyn, the head of the church at Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The Vikings arrived on November 25, 885, and immediately demanded tribute. Their demand was rejected, and they began the siege. On November 26, the Danes attacked the northeastern towers using siege weapons such as ballistae, mangonels, and catapults, bombarding the towers with arrows and stones. However, they were repelled by the defenders, who poured down boiling tar and pitch on them. That day, all Viking attacks were thwarted, and during the night, the Parisians rebuilt the upper levels of the damaged tower. On November 27, the Vikings launched another assault, involving tunnel digging, siege attacks, and missile fire, but it was all in vain. On that day, Jocelyn, the brave abbot, stepped out onto the ramparts and joined the battle armed with a bow and a battle axe. He planted a cross outside the city's defenses and called upon all men to fight. His brother Ebles also joined the battle. For 2 months, the Vikings dug tunnels and built trenches around their camps to protect themselves from surprise attacks. In January 886, they tried to fill the shallow river areas with debris, branches, dead animals, and even human corpses, executed prisoners, to allow their infantry to reach the watchtowers. But they failed once again. They continued this for 2 more days. On the 3rd day, they set fire to 3 ships and sent them toward the wooden bridge. However, the ships sank before they could spread the fire to the bridge. Nevertheless, the wooden bridge was weakened. On February 6th, heavy rains caused the river, now clogged with debris from the Vikings' previous attempts, to overflow and wash away the bridge's supports. The bridge collapsed, leaving the northeastern watchtower isolated, with only 12 defenders inside. The Vikings demanded their surrender, but they refused. All 12 men were subsequently killed. The Vikings left behind a small force, while the main army moved on, raiding the cities of Le Mans and Chartres. At this time, Odo successfully sent messengers past the Viking lines to Italy, begging Charles for reinforcements. Henry, Count of Saxony, Charles's representative in Germany, marched to Paris. The Vikings had to scatter, and supplies were brought into the city. Viking morale dropped, and Sigfrid demanded 60 pounds of silver. After receiving the payment, he left the siege in April. However, another Viking leader, Rollo, and his men remained. By May, plague spread throughout Paris, and Jocelyn, the spiritual leader and warrior priest, died from illness. Odo himself then slipped past the Viking lines to personally request support from Charles, who agreed to send reinforcements. Odo fought his way back to Paris, and Charles and Henry of Saxony marched north. However, Henry died on the way. In the summer, the Danes made one final attempt to capture the city but were repelled once more. The Imperial army arrived in October, forcing the Vikings to retreat. Charles laid siege to Rollo and his forces and set up a camp at Montmartre. However, Charles had no intention of fighting. Instead, he sent his troops down the Seine to devastate Burgundy, which was in rebellion. When the Vikings finally left France in the spring of the following year, Charles paid them 700 pounds of silver, as promised. Consequences. The refusal of the people of Paris and Odo to allow the Vikings to sail down the Seine forced the invaders to drag their ships overland to reach the Marne River. When Charles died in 888, the French people chose Odo as their king. Later, Odo's brother was also elected king. Throughout the next century, the Robertian dynasty, descendants of Robert the Strong, fought against the Carolingians for the throne of France. Their duchy, France, became the namesake of the kingdom, which later became modern France. And the Carolingian Empire was never reunited again.